You're listening to the Practicing Law Librarian. This limited series is part of PLI's Ever Current podcast, where we bring you insights and updates from legal thought leaders. Find additional episodes at pli.edu or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Karen Oesterle. Welcome to the Practicing Law Librarian podcast, presented by PLI's Legal Information Services Group. This podcast brings you conversations with and for the law librarian community. As a practicing law librarian myself, I've been working in legal information services for 34 years, currently with PLI's Library Relations Group. For this episode, I was excited to talk with Donna Nixon and learn about several UNC-Chapel Hill law students and their important role in the civil rights movement. Donna's North Carolina Law Review article on their story is fascinating, and she continues to curate the library's digital collection of related documents. With Donna, we focused on her electronic resource work, her article on integration at UNC-Chapel Hill, curating the archives, and digitizing and making accessible their local collection and critical documents. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome this morning, and thank you so much for joining me. I was just wondering if you're from New York, because not too many people from outside New York end up going to Brooklyn, and you are.
Yes, I was born and grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and my family is still there.
Okay, so a little bit of overlap. You worked at the New York Unified Court System before you even graduated college?
When I came from a working class background, and I received a 2-year degree from New York City Technical College. And then I went to work for the city of New York in its Department of Transportation. And one of my colleagues one day came in with a bunch of applications for a test that was being offered to get positions with the New York State Unified Court System. And I filled out the application and took the test, did well. And eventually I was called and offered a position with the New York State Unified Court System. I started out in the Manhattan Supreme Court building, which is actually a misnomer. As you know,
Right.
New York State Court building is actually a trial court there. But it's the iconic building you see in many of the law TV programs. So I started out there, and most of my career, though, I worked for the Brooklyn Civil Court. And even before I started with the court, I went back to school at night and on weekends to get my 4-year degree. And I didn't really have any career objective with that. I was just a person that loved to learn.
And then you went to law school. I mean, that's not something one does casually.
You work for the courts, you learn a little bit about the law. And in fact, in my career, I took further tests to be promoted. And these promotional tests asked about the law. And so you had to study the law a little bit in order to pass those tests or to do well on those tests. And so
Right.
I ended up doing well and getting promoted to senior court clerk. And so I worked also in Nassau District Court, but for most of my career, I worked at the Brooklyn Civil Court. And so some of my colleagues were both court officers and clerks and what have you. They were going to law school. And so once I had reached kind of the upper limits of the ability to be promoted through these promotional tests, this was an option for me. And so I thought about it because my colleagues were going to Brooklyn Law School is just within walking distance of the
Right.
Brooklyn Civil Court. And
Right.
so it also has a part-time program. So I thought I'll just go to school part-time and continue just as I did.
As you had been.
To get my 4-year degree. So I applied to and took the LSAT, the law SATs.
Right. So then you went to California. And did you like Northern California? Did you like Palo Alto?
I did. I just had a wonderful
Oh,
4 years there. I did not plan to go to California, but when I applied for the LSAT, I did check a box that allowed law schools to contact me. And I was contacted by several law schools, and Stanford offered some funds toward a flight to go to Stanford for their admit weekend.
Right, to
And
come and visit.
yeah, and I just took it as an opportunity to go to a place that I'd never been, never
Right,
really intending to actually go to school there.
right,
And the place was beautiful. It is just a wonderful place, but also the environment there at the law school was just so welcoming. And my peers were so welcoming. And there was really not the competitive atmosphere that I expected. These were really bright people, but they didn't take themselves too seriously for the most part. And they cared about each other, and they were very collegial.
Well, that's wonderful. You don't always find that in the Ivy League, but that's really good to hear, and I'm glad that you liked it. It's a beautiful area. Then you practiced for a couple years at Pillsbury Madison in Sutro.
I practiced for just about a year. I had experienced small firm and large firm summer associateship, and I also worked for the Texas Attorney General's office in the Natural Resources Division one summer. So all of those experiences, none of them really resonated with me, and the quality of life in lawyering didn't seem to really fit me.
Right,
So I was looking for a good fit somewhere, and I had reached my third year of law school when they had an alternative careers panel. And there, one of the postings for the panel mentioned that there would be a librarian on the panel. And that piqued my curiosity. It was some career that never was on my radar.
right,
And I I almost missed that panel because I was in work study, and my work study time frame overlapped the beginning of the presentation, and
right.
I don't like walking into presentations. But I ran into a classmate who was also interested in attending the career panel, and so we went together. And Erica Wayne, who she's no longer in law librarianship, but she was just a wonderful law librarian whom I would not have probably connected with at Stanford had it not been for this panel.
Right.
She was the person who spoke. And the minute she started speaking, a light bulb went off. Everything about the career that she talked about was just, it seemed such a good fit for me. The ability to serve people, the ability to be a lifetime learner, the quality of life, the opportunity to teach. It all just was, yeah, it was something that was a good match. So I am very lucky that I stumbled upon all of those things, and I can't say what career would have fit me more accurately.
Right. Well, that's wonderful. So you went to get your MLS, and then you have been a librarian ever since, right?
I have.
And how did you get from Stanford to UNC-Chapel Hill?
So after that panel, I talked with Erica, and she told me the steps one would need to make in order to become an academic law librarian. The type of academic law librarian that I wanted to be, a reference librarian.
Right.
And that involved going to school to get my master's in library science. So I needed to take the GRE. And I was graduating law school with about $100,000 in debt.
Oof.
And so my goal was not to incur any further debt. And so she told me about scholarship opportunities and how to apply. And so I took the GRE and applied for scholarships. And I practiced for a year while I was going through that process. And I'm glad that I practiced for that year because it helped me pay off a chunk of that law school loan. And so
Right.
I didn't have to worry very much about the debt by the time I started library school.
Well, that was smart.
That was smart and lucky, yes.
Interesting. And you've been a law librarian ever since UNC-Chapel Hill, and then briefly at Duke, and then back to UNC-Chapel Hill.
Yes, I've been in a variety of roles. I started out as actually a reference assistant as a student. Then our library had a graduate assistantship program, which basically allowed a student still in library school to work 20 hours a week for the library, basically a half-time position.
Right.
And it came with some benefits which were nice. And so I got further exposure and experience because they made sure that I got exposure to the different departments in the library. And when I graduated, I was lucky that they happened to have a reference position open. And I applied for it and was one of the applicants who interviewed, and I got the position. And since then I've been in various roles. I was a reference librarian. I then moved to Duke as the head of reference, and then I came back to UNC as the head of public services, and moved from there to electronic resources librarian and access services librarian. And now my focus is on electronic resources. I am also a clinical professor of law, so I teach each year. For the last several years, I've taught Introduction to U.S. Law for our exchange students. But before that, I taught legal research and advanced legal research.
Now, when you say clinical professor of law, to me that makes me envision clinics where they're doing work. Is that accurate?
No, so they give that title to professors that work in clinics, but also to people that teach skills.
Okay.
And so we teach research skills. And so our title is clinical professor or clinical assistant professor. And I've risen to clinical professor.
Okay. Thank you. And access services, I mean, that's a librarian term, but for people that are not librarians, what does that mean?
And it may mean different things in different libraries. So thank you for asking. It is a term that usually refers to the circulation desk, the main desk that people check in and check out materials, and that keeps the library open and staffed with all the hours that the library is open. But access services also often includes interlibrary lending.
Oh, okay. So you oversee that.
I oversaw that, and that piece is now under public services. So my focus now is just on electronic resources and teaching.
Okay. And so do you manage the contracts for the electronic resources? Okay. So you've got the vendor relations. You're
Yes.
writing the Westlaw contract and Lexis contract and PLI.
Yes. Yeah. So my role can be different at different institutions, but here I keep abreast of all the latest digital products. I set up information sessions and trials and demos for material that we might be interested in purchasing or subscribing to. And then I negotiate with the vendors and review and ask for changes to contracts. And then once we have signed a contract, I make sure that the resources are available and discoverable for our users. And then I maintain the resources, troubleshoot any problems with access to those resources, and that is a lot of my focus.
And so that includes student access and faculty access and staff access, right?
Yes. And I also work to evaluate the usage of those resources and most recently, the accessibility of those resources for anyone with disabilities.
Right. Right. So this would be the natural time to ask you about artificial intelligence. And, all the major platforms have a facet now, have it included. How are you handling that? I mean, how is that changing the electronic resources librarian job?
It's not more conversations and more attendance at events that explain what each of the vendors' AI products do. So our reps for the various products have set up times to meet with us to discuss what the features are of their AI and what limitations they have, and also what limitations we as law school subscribers have as far as access, because primary clients.
Right.
And so there may be restrictions on how much we can use those products. As you probably know, it takes a lot of resources for these companies to provide this generative AI access. It it's resource intensive. Generative AI is, and so there are often restrictions on how much or what we can use in their generative AI products.
Right. When I began in law librarians, and that was 1989, everything was print. And we had just come out, I was with Matthew Bender and then LexisNexis, and we had just come out with CD-ROMs, and that was state of the art. And you're smiling. You remember those days.
I did.
And that was, that was a big deal. That was revolutionary. And so that, West had premise and we had authority. And now, of course, things have changed. On that spectrum between everything print and everything electronic, where is your library? Where are you guys on that spectrum? And how are you handling that?
We are much more on the electronic side now. We have, over the last few years, eliminated a lot of our print products. Sometimes the company that used to sell them have decided not to provide print
Right.
anymore because it is costly and not as well utilized in some cases. So we are heavily on the electronic side, but that brings issues with it. When you have print, you own it. And as expensive as it can be, you can lend it to your colleagues who may not have the funds to buy or these expensive subscriptions. So with our electronic products, we often are restricted from lending. Those agreements often restrict lending. And it is a concern because it limits access to information, especially when you think about access to justice issues.
Right. Right. And there's a particular how do I phrase it? There's a particular digital library, digital collection that you're in charge of. I want to ask you about the Digital Collection Law School first. I had the pleasure of reviewing that over the last couple of days and also reading your North Carolina Law Review essay, which documents the successful legal fight by the 5 men who integrated UNC-Chapel Hill. That's certainly part of your electronic resources collection. So do you want to talk about that a bit? I have to imagine that's been just really important and, a seminal effort. Can you talk about how that came about and what you do with that?
Yes, I was the main developer of that collection, and it is the one I am most proud of. I had an interest in African American history, and I had helped with the library's displays for Black History Month over the years. And I learned through mounting some of those displays that the law school at UNC was the first division at UNC-Chapel Hill, indeed in the state of North Carolina, to integrate. But it wasn't a voluntary integration. And there had been litigation against UNC-Chapel Hill and the law school. And that was instrumental in the bigger civil rights litigation that culminated in Brown versus Board of Education. And so the NAACP strategy was to build these litigations in different states and then bring those cases up to the United States Supreme Court. So I learned about that litigation eventually. I initially, when I was doing these displays, I was just, clueless about the background. So I learned more about that. And eventually, our library management team invited me to create a digital collection that chronicled that fight to integrate UNC-Chapel Hill. And so I reached into the wonderfully rich archives here at UNC-Chapel Hill. Our campus has a collection. There are several collections in UNC's special collections library. Wilson Library holds many of these archives of the university, Chapel Hill, the whole university system, and North Carolina generally. So it collects a rich amount of material. It collects newspaper articles and news material. It collects the correspondence of leaders within the UNC system and the
Right.
state. It collects the correspondence of law school deans. And so all of that is available. And I was able to go over to that library and sit and go through certain files from the law school dean's office, from the chancellor's office, from the UNC system office, and and gather together material to create this digital collection for the law school. And it's the first digital collection that chronicles, the African American leaders from that are affiliated with the law school. So
Right.
it was wonderful.
That's really quite something. I mean, when you're speaking of the breadth of that collection, it sounds like the presidential papers. Everything's been collected and saved.
Yes, it was really forward thinking of the librarians here to collect information. They clipped newspapers because in those days, of course, there was no digital. They
Right.
clipped newspaper articles that had to do with this whole integration
Right.
issue, the segregation issue, and the litigation. And I was able, from the archives, to get almost all of the material that was filed in court, the complaints, the appeals, the briefs,
Right.
all of the litigation documents. I was able to collect those and scan them and make them available in the digital collection. But I
Right.
also was able to get access to the interviews with the young men who integrated the law school. Some of them had several interviews over the years. And I was able to listen to them speak about their experiences in their own voices because the Wilson Library has oral histories, oral history collections,
Right.
and those interviews are part of that.
That is really quite something. I did not get to those. I saw that you had newspaper images going back to 1937, in that collection.
Yes, and I
Um,
linked directly to the audio for some of those oral histories, so it's great.
that is really something. You must be very proud of that. It's quite impressive.
I am, thank you. And I really have to give props to Anne Kleinfelter. She was a great mentor for me. And so she basically suggested things that I probably would not have done all this time. And one of the things we talked about the law review article associated with that digital collection.
Right.
Well, I wanted to put so much stuff that I had learned into that digital collection, but it was too much for a website. So they were eventually like, no, we can't have you add all of this stuff in there, but you should write a law review article about it. And the North Carolina Law Review would be the perfect law review for it. And the North Carolina Law Review has one issue that they devote to the history of North Carolina. And so I sent my article in and they accepted it.
And it's terrific. And I read it yesterday. And I think, if memory serves, it's 54 pages long. So it's a significant piece of
It's heavily
academic work.
footnoted. Yes.
It is heavily footnoted, but as it should be. But I hadn't realized. I was going to ask which came first, but now it makes sense. They must have said, people won't look at everything on a website if you put all this here, but an article will get out to a much broader audience. Is there an interest at UNC-Chapel Hill to expand that collection even more, or is it a continuing effort already?
We are always interested in anything that we can add to that collection. And one of the things that I've experienced over the years, not too often, but someone will reach out to me from the family or from the community and say, I have, certain information that you might want to add to the collection.
Right. From an alumni or someone who had worked there. That's fabulous. I want to ask, what do you see as recent trends in libraries? I mean, you guys are very devoted. Your library is very devoted to several different things. I mean, making the history available to people, the historical documents, but also, completely staying ahead of the curve on your electronic resources. And you're looking into AI, you're talking with the vendors about that and carefully deciding and considering how that can help your students and your faculty and your staff. What do you see sort of as the future for your library?
One major thing I see for the future of the library is that we will be more integrated in teaching at the law school. The ABA has updated its requirements for law schools, and one of them is that expanding the practical teaching.
Oh,
And legal research has become more prominent in the expectations. And most law schools currently only teach first year legal research. And from my experience, it's hard for students in first year legal research to grasp the small amount of information they get on research, because first year research is part of legal research and writing, usually. And the real focus is on the writing and the and oral advocacy in most law schools. So there's not a lot of focus on research, but even when there is, when students have not had any actual experience having to do research, that it may not sink in. And so students are going out into their first summer positions and realizing where the gaps lie.
right.
And that is when I think second and third year is when there's a good opportunity to really get them interested and get it to sink in more. So I see our library has already expanded at legal research. We have several advanced legal research courses, and we have some that are specialized toward a certain type of practice. But we also have begun expanding our teaching, and Stacy Rowland is really important in this, to law practice technology and law practice technologies, which basically gives students exposure to some of the digital technologies that they will experience in practice, like e-discovery platforms and time management software and, intranets and stuff. Yes.
The portals, client portals and case management software, these kind of things.
But there's also a competency in cybersecurity and client confidentiality.
And again, you guys are way ahead of the curve because, various states are adding CLE requirements for technology awareness and technology competence and client confidentiality and online, all those sorts of rules and confidentiality practices. So again, you guys are ahead of the curve. You've already got the classes ready for those.
Yes, and my colleague is really great at introducing students to all of the information that is collected when we go through our day and how that can be used in litigation and misused in litigation.
Right. What changes do you anticipate as we move ever further down that road?
I think that the use of generative AI is going to be something that we have to address, whether and how we determine if generative AI is biased or is being misused in some way. But I think also how we can utilize generative AI to streamline and perhaps make our processes more accurate. So, for instance, document review. You might be able to more efficiently, more quickly, and more accurately pinpoint things in documents that you need to for your client work.
It's funny, we're thinking ahead with generative AI, and you gave some very good examples of that, but we're also thinking back because of the strong archival collection that you all have. How does your library maintain the archival information now? Have you seen any recent changes in that as technology has advanced?
We haven't at the law library been focused too much on archival work, but it's kind of nice to do if we have time for projects like that. But the main library has been addressing what collections are significant that we can digitize, and not just digitize, but that we take the time and energy to provide metadata that will make it more accessible and more discoverable. Also, the libraries have been focused on looking at some of the legacy terms that have been used to describe collections
Right, and updating those and
and
correcting those.
updating those and looking at some of the bias in those terms and figuring
Right,
out ways to alleviate that.
right. There's so much that we're needing to look back on, terms many of us never thought about, never realized had those meanings. And now there's so much there. Let me ask at this point about your AALL work because it's just astonishing. I pulled this from the AALL.org, and the list of what you do and what you have done is lengthy. It's pages long, and it looks like you started right away when you came into the field. 2002, you jumped on the professional development committee, and you were in 2001, you were an award recipient of the Minority Leadership Development Award. But then you continued to work the Career Development Task Force, Executive Board Strategic Directions Committee, and you were board liaison on, I think, a dozen different committees. And I met you in person for the first time last year in Richmond in March of 2023.
I was vice president elect. I am the current president of the Southeastern Association of Law Libraries.
Thank you.
So we have a 3-year term, and that's really to make it easy, continuity wise,
Right.
for the association to operate. So you start out as vice president, president elect, and you handle the meeting. And so I was handling the Richmond meeting,
Right.
and then you go into the presidency, and then you go into the role of past president. So in May, I'll be turning over the gavel to my colleague Bo Steinken, and then I'll be past president. But yes, that is exciting stuff.
You've been very active in AALL and the local library associations as well. And how I look at these lists, I think, how on earth did you find time to do all your regular work with all this volunteer committee work?
I have been extremely lucky that my library values our professional activities, our professional involvement. And it's actually in our performance goals
Oh,
to be professionally active. And so it's expected and it's supported, including with a little bit of your work time. And so I was able to do that. I don't know that the whole system is that way, or even the other libraries on campus, but it really is leadership, what your leadership is, what prioritizes. And our leadership happens to prioritize that. And I know other law schools that are part of the UNC system, or one law school that's part of the UNC system that doesn't necessarily have that as a priority.
Interesting. No, PLI is very supportive of that. Alexa Robertson is my manager, and I guess I'm just committee chair now, but with Lagny, I was treasurer, and then I was chair of corporate sponsorship, and now I'm just chair of grants and scholarships. And I also do that for Aluni, and also co-vice president of Aluni. So PLI is very supportive of that as well. We're fortunate.
And I just have to say that it is short-sighted to not prioritize professional development, because it is not just about the employee. It's about what connections they can make and what they can learn to help your organization. And it is poor practice to isolate your law librarians to the point where they don't have those connections. And I just can't emphasize how important it is. Those connections, the networking. I've co-written articles with people that I just happen to meet at conferences.
Right.
And I've learned so much from the programming that AALL and NCO provide, and the publications that they provide. So I think it's really short-sighted not to invest in the professional development of your librarians and staff.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. So that's wonderful that you have that. Let me ask you about how you guys use PLI Plus, because you have access to that. And we had that phone call some months ago with your library relations manager, to connect the both of you. And that's part of your electronic services librarian task, is my guess. So how do you guys use PLI?
So we use PLI to find templates for some agreements and contracts. We also use the PLI resources to teach our student about some of the practice materials that are available and that can be helpful as they go out into their legal employment. So those are ways that we use PLI.
Terrific. Thank you. How would you predict the future of law libraries?
Wow. I think our physical spaces will change, probably shrink, but I also think that our digital presence will be more important, and that we will become more broad in our roles, including depending on what type of organization that you are in. But I already see that law librarians are doing competitive intelligence work, they're doing knowledge management work, they're doing records management work. So I think that our roles, they're also helping with, e-discovery and things like that. So I think that roles, especially in law firms, will be more multifaceted. And I think there'll be more of a role for teaching people how to use resources electronically, because when you have physical collections, you can point a person to a set of resources and show them the table of contents and indexes and how to use the resource. People don't always reach out to you when they have access to digital material. So it'll be more important to, number one, makes those digital materials more discoverable, and to actually push those resources to our patrons and teach them how to best use them more efficiently, more accurately.
It's been a challenge since the beginning of electronic resources to help people get their head around what the resource is. With the book, you can see it's 47 volumes. Oh, okay, that gives you a different mindset. Or it's 2 volumes, it's a handbook. But I think for years, people, unless if they were new to that electronic resource, unless they had some idea of the scope of it and the depth of it, they really didn't always use it properly.
Absolutely. And It's hard. We've had these discussions within law librarianship as we transitioned more to electronic resources about the gaps that our patrons have in their
Right.
knowledge and understanding of the resources. When you don't necessarily have the ability to show them the table of contents and how to use that, or the index and how to use that, or they don't understand how Keysight or Shepherd's developed over time and why it is structured the way that it is, so that
Right.
you can more clearly understand the both the strengths and the limitations.
Given your experience, what are some of the most important learnings that you would want to share with other librarians, with other law librarians?
Wow. There are several things. The top one is the importance of connecting with your colleagues and investing in your regional and national associations by maintaining memberships, by volunteering, and by utilizing the expertise, the resources, the people that those associations give you access to. The second is the value of connecting with the communities you serve. There's a phrase now, nothing about us without us. And it's a philosophy that resonates with me because you can't be really good at knowing what your audience needs unless you talk to them and connect with them about their needs. And going back to associations, I think that we see a lot less investment in our associations. And some people coming up don't necessarily see the value of the associations because that value can be a bit amorphous. It's not as tangible as we will give you X, Y, Z, and you can quantify it. It's more unquantified, but it is priceless. Creating and maintaining those connections to colleagues, tapping into the professional development, the best practices, and being able to reach out to somebody when you're going through a certain situation so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Right.
That is so important. And I think that my advice is to invest in it, even if your organization is not willing to pay for that. It is a value to you that is priceless. The other thing that I recommend is just seeking out mentors. I was lucky. A mentor took me on as a person to mentor without me really reaching out to them. But I've had several good mentors, but one great mentor. And I don't think you should wait until one falls into your lap. One fell into my lap, but that is not necessarily going to be the case for everyone. So
Right.
if you can reach out to someone that you'd like to know professionally, ask them a question or two, or chat them up at a meeting. Again, these benefits are not quantifiable, but we all benefit from the knowledge and assistance of our peers.
Right. The connections. And also the benefit is cumulative.
Yeah.
It's not instant. And so it takes some work. It takes some time, to
Yeah.
get to know more people.
Yeah. I have one more thing that I would say to new librarians, and that is let people know your interests as they evolve. One thing that we can do these days that maybe wasn't the case in years prior is that we can work with our organizations to craft a job that brings together several of our interests for the benefit of our organization. And so there's much more ability to create the job that works the best for you. And
Right.
so I would make sure that I let people know what I'm interested in so that if an opportunity comes up, or if they have an opportunity to create more opportunities for you, they'll do that.
Thank you. Thank you. What do you wish you had known when you began your career? I presume that you're not sorry that you went to practice for a few years because you were able to pay off a bunch of your school debt and you had that experience, which is always good.
What I wish I had known, I wish I had known how to do research because my first year of law school, just like everyone else, I had first year legal research and writing, but it was really focused on the writing and advocacy. And got to my first summer position realizing that I had a big gap. And even when I graduated law school, there was still a big gap there because the practice that I was in the licensing division, and that was, looking over contracts and creating contracts. So
Right.
that didn't necessarily map into legal research.
Right.
So I got to library school not really knowing much legal research. And it was great that I was able to get a part-time position at the law library and learn from the librarians how to do legal research.
Terrific. Thank you. What else have I forgotten to ask that we should talk about?
You mentioned before maybe talking about sharing anything that I might be reading for work or for pleasure.
Yes.
I'm happy to say that, it's quite kind of odd that most of my reading over the past few years, many years, since I went to law school, has been for work. And it's mainly been, articles and what have you. And I've definitely benefited from being able to read articles by faculty and other scholars and practitioners about different aspects of law. I'm always curious about those, especially access to justice and what have you. But recently, I've started reading more, prioritizing reading for fun because I just haven't been doing a lot of it. And
Right.
I am in what is now a 30-year-old book club. I've only been in that club for about the last 10 or so years. But my former colleague, Carol Nicholson, I call her the benevolent dictator of our book club. But she and some of her friends created this book club about 30 years ago. And so I read things that I would not have read had it not been for that club. And we're reading it focused mostly on fiction, but now we're reading more biographies and memoirs and a wider variety of fiction. And fiction that has to do with different cultures is
Right.
really something that I love. And culture that I am particularly enamored of is the culture of India. And so I've, over the years, read some really great books about India or about aspects of Indian life. And one of them is Holy Cow, an Indian adventure by Sarah McDonald. Shantaram by Gregory David Roberts, which is just a wonderful writer. And now I'm reading The Covenant of Water by Abraham Verghese. And this is the author of a earlier book, Cutting for Stone, and just an amazing writer.
And then Cutting for Stone. That was the other book by the Abraham author that you mentioned. Have you been to India?
I have. Yes. I've been twice. My first trip was to southern India, and the second was to my first trip was to northern India, the second to southern India. And I just loved northern India. It's just, oh my gosh.
How did you come upon this, or how did you develop this particular fascination?
I don't know. Oh, I think I do know. I love dance. And Indian dance is just classical Indian dance forms, and there are several, are just amazing. And the skill and the amount of years of learning required to get to that skill level is just immense.
Right.
So, yeah, so I've been fascinated by Indian dance. I've been to some Indian festivals, one or two. And so just the beautiful colors that people wear, the beautiful people.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. Well, who would have thought? That's a surprise, but that's lovely. Lovely.
It's such a pleasure to talk to you, Karen. Thank you for asking me to have this conversation.
Well, I'm so glad that we did. Thank you for joining us. And it's just been wonderful. We meet in passing at Chicago or at Boston, and we sit in the same meeting and say hello, and then we move on. But it's nice. It's a gift to have this kind of time together. And so thank you for joining us. Thank you for your everything, for your activities, for your work with AALL, for your work with students. We appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Practicing Law Librarian, part of PLI's Ever Current podcast. Be sure to subscribe and listen to our latest episodes wherever you listen to podcasts. And to learn more about the Practicing Law Institute, please visit pli.edu. To learn more about PLI Plus, which provides electronic access to the full collection of PLI Press publications, and schedule a demo with a member of our team, please visit pli.edu/plus. Please note that the views and opinions expressed during this podcast represent those of the individuals being interviewed and not necessarily those of PLI.